Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Sameach. So just a teaser about tomorrow while the handouts are coming out. Of course, tomorrow is second day Yom Tov. We'll begin at 9 a.m. tomorrow. The conversation we'll have tomorrow is, should a woman recline at the Seder? We know that it's a mitzvah to recline at the Seder. The Mishnah is very clear that every man, even a poor man in Israel, not the Seder, but a poor man among the people of Israel, is supposed to recline, is obligated to recline at the Seder table. Should a woman? And that's the conversation we will have tomorrow. So hopefully you will plan to join us. And so now while the handouts are coming out, we are in our Torah portion this morning, and of course last night at the Seder, we were consumed with this idea of plagues. But how many plagues were there? Now maybe to begin answering that question, how many plagues were there? I'll ask you the question, how many times did you stick your finger into your wine cup last night and draw out wine?
13.
Exactly right. 13. Right? Why 13? The 10 plagues plus the 3 mnemonics that help us remember what the plagues are. Right? Now, okay, out of curiosity, how many people are spillers? Who spills? On purpose spills. Who's a pinky dipper? Who's a fork or spoon dipper? Who gets right in there with an index finger? Now, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, who lived a few hundred years ago and really took the Shulchan Aruch and made it appropriate for Ashkenazi Jews, he says God used his index finger, as it were, to strike the plagues, and thus when we dip our wine, we're actually supposed to use our index finger to lessen our joy when we use our index finger. Now, I'm not going to ask this question. I'm curious how many people then lick their fingers with the wine after dipping. The answer is you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that because the whole idea is to lessen our joy. We're sad about the whole plagues. So we lessen our joy, so you can't dip it out and then you lick all the good stuff off your finger. You have to use a napkin, I'm sorry. So we now come to this question of how many plagues were there? And one easy answer would be to just jump right to the book of Exodus and answer, of course, we know how many plagues does the book of Exodus tell us? 10. And we'll look at those in 1 second. But let's jump ahead in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, to Psalm 78. And I'll read Psalm 78, and I want you to call out plague whenever we get to a plague. He turned their rivers to blood.
Plague.
They could not drink from their streams. He sent swarms of flies that devoured them, and frogs that devastated them. He gave their crops to the grasshopper, their produce to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamore figs with sleet.
Never heard that.
What do we think? Is it the same? All right, a little parallelism going on. He gave over their cattle to the hail, their livestock to bolts of lightning. Okay, we're not sure. He unleashed against them his hot anger, his wrath, indignation, and hostility, a band of destroying angels. He prepared a path for his anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave them over to the plague. He struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, the first fruits of manhood, in the tents of Hannah. Okay, I don't know how many kosher ham, right? Ham being one of the sons of Noah, not the other white meat. How many plagues, according to Psalm 78? I'm counting 8 by our count. Okay, Exodus said 10. Psalm 78 seems to indicate 8. Now let's compare to Psalm 105. Yell out plague, please, when we get to a plague. Literalists among us. All right. He sent darkness and made the land dark.
Plague.
For had they not rebelled against his words? He turned their waters into blood, causing their fish to die. Their land teemed with frogs, which went up to the bedrooms of their rulers. Right? Thus giving rise to the song, one day when Pharaoh awoke in his bed, there were frogs in his bed and frogs in his bed. All right. That's the favorite verse. Maybe just ours. All right. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and gnats throughout their country. He turned their rain into hail, with lightning throughout their land. He struck down their vines and fig trees and shattered the trees of their country. He spoke and the locusts came, grasshoppers without number. Is it a plague or is it a parallelism? They ate up every green thing in their land, ate up the produce of their soil. Then he struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of all their land. How many do we count? 8. So Psalm 78 seems to suggest 8 plagues. Psalm 105 seems to suggest 8 plagues. The book of Exodus will come to suggest 10. So I'll let you do this homework on your own. Which are missing from the Psalms narrative? This is your, what's that? Boils. All right, there were apparently better dermatologists according to the Psalms than, and what else? Lice. Okay, they had the lice doctors. All right. So those seem to be the 2 plagues missing from the Psalms edition. So now we come to the next page, to the 10 plagues, of course. And I just happened to copy it, just so you know, from the Haggadah called the Family Participation Haggadah, A Different Night, by Noam Zion and David Dishon. It's just a very good Haggadah. I recommend it. So I use that for copies. So here, of course, we come to the 10 plagues as we traditionally know them. Dam, Sfardeya, Kini, Arov, Deber, Shkin, Barad, Arbe, Chosha, and Makot Bechorot. Rabbi Yehuda Ayad Notem Mahem Simanim. Rabbi Judah used to abbreviate them with the acrostic. Ditzach, Adash, Biacha. Right, and tonight you're saying, what are you going to use to dip? Right hand. So really less, but don't lift your finger. Which hand? Great question. You always use your right. Always use your right hand. And Judaism is very prejudiced, against left-handed people. But any culture with ancient traditions, the left hand was used for something else. Except for tefillin, which is actually a good counter. So we come now to the 10 plagues. And what I'm going to be curious about, let's go through them again. There are 5 couplings of 10. And I want you to identify why there are those 5 couplings of 10. Blood and frogs, lice and insects, cattle plague and boils, hail and locusts, darkness and death of the firstborn. 5 couplings of 10. What do blood and frogs have in common? So they come from the water, but not just any water in this case, the Nile River. So we know that in ancient Egypt, the Nile was one of, Mason, your Zadie's right over this way.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yep, we're multitasking today. So we have blood and frogs both coming out of the Nile River. And of course, among the reasons for the plagues is that God is supposed to be showing the Egyptians who's really in charge. God is sending a message to the Egyptians. God is also sending a message to the Israelites. So lest the Israelites, and certainly lest the Egyptians, continue to think that the Nile was a divine source for them, God struck first at the Nile. The Egyptians saw the Nile as their life force. They even considered it among the gods. So God first struck at the Nile, turning it into blood and then bringing forth frogs from it. And as you know, the Hebrew says Sfardeya, which is one frog. So according to the Midrash, only one ginormous frog came out of the Nile. Moses then struck it with his staff, and it turned into millions of frogs. All right, so that's coupling number one coming from the Nile. Lice and insects. What do they have in common? They're bugs, right? Meant to annoy, meant to bother, right? Do lice and insects kill? No, but they're meant to really drive people crazy. Cattle plague and boils. Illnesses, right? Infections. One affects humans, one affects the livestock. Hail and locusts. Destroy crops. Exactly right. We're going after agriculture now. So we've shown that the Nile is not a god. We've driven humans batty, if you will. Then we've sent illnesses. Now, hail and locusts. We've destroyed the crops. And of course, then we come to darkness and death in the firstborn. What do those have? Fear. And not just any kind of fear in this case, supernatural fear. All the other 8 plagues are all about nature. Right? They're struck against the Egyptians in very natural ways. I mean, the sun is taken out in the middle of the day. And only the Egyptians are blinded, but the Israelites can walk around in perfect vision. That's clearly a supernatural plague. And then, of course, the death of the firstborn that only affects the Egyptians and not the Israelites. That is a statement of God's overwhelming strength. So there you have the 10 plagues. Do you have any questions about the 8, or the 10? Yeah, Dave?
Why does it wild geese or insects?
We don't really understand what the Hebrew is. It's not really used anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And that's why actually the typical translation often goes to insects because of the coupling with lice. It just seems to be a more natural coupling. So here, Wendy, go ahead. Frequently, Pharaoh changes his mind. First he says, okay, go ahead and get out. And then he says, no, I'm changing my mind. And then ultimately we know that God begins to harden Pharaoh's heart and prevent him from changing his mind. And that's really how we get to the 10 plagues. And that's why, at least in my belief, I think these 10 plagues are more than just about changing the Egyptians' minds. If God just wanted the Israelites to go free, God could have accomplished it with fewer than 10 plagues, because ultimately Pharaoh was changing his mind. God was sending a message, not only to the Egyptians, but to the Israelites. God began realizing, I have to do more than just get the Israelites out of Egypt. I have to begin to really show them that I am the Lord their God. All right, so we have 8, we have 10. If you'll now turn with me, please, to the next page, to our rabbis now really having fun with the plagues. Rabbi Yossi the Galilean posed the riddle. How do you know that God struck the Egyptians with only 10 blows in Egypt, while God struck them with 50 blows at the Red Sea? Solution: in Egypt, the Torah says, God used one finger, just as the Egyptians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But at the Red Sea, God used the whole hand. That is to say, it says Israel saw the great hand that God used against Egypt. Logically, if one finger produced 10 plagues in Egypt, then a whole hand produced 50 plagues at the Red Sea. Rabbi Eliezer posed the riddle. How do you know that each of the 10 plagues in Egypt was really 4 plagues rolled into one? Solution: in Psalm 78, God's burning anger at the Egyptians is described with 4 extra synonyms: wrath, indignation, trouble, and a band of deadly messengers. Each of the 10 plagues, must have 4 dimensions. Logically, God struck 40 blows in Egypt using just one finger. Egypt. So each of the 10 has 4 dimensions. That's 40 plagues. Right? God struck 40 blows in Egypt using just one finger. Thus, as God used his whole hand at the Red Sea, God struck 200 blows then at the Red Sea. Finally, Rabbi Akiva posed the riddle, how do you know that each of the 10 plagues in Egypt was really 5 plagues rolled into one? Now, he again refers to Psalm 78. We must figure 5 synonyms for anger expressing each plague. God inflicted 1 is burning anger, 2 wrath, 3 indignation, 4 trouble, and 5 a band of deadly messengers. Logically, God struck 50 blows in Egypt, and thus 250 at the Red Sea. How many people read these midrashim at their Seder? Just out of curiosity. A few people. It's built into some of the Haggadot. At least in my experience, at some of the Seders I've been to, you typically read through it, but no one really processes what in the world that means. Right? You know, it's reading without processing. Why all this talk about 10, 50, 40, 200, 250 plays? What is the message being sent? I think the message being sent is that God sends all sorts of actions to earth. Some we attribute to God, some we don't. But as it says in the prophet Isaiah, God is the one who creates everything, both the good and the evil. And so as we look at our world today, we're mindful that there are far more than just 10 plagues plaguing our society. There's probably more than 40 or 50, probably closer to 200 or 250 plagues. As we go through our Seder, which is really supposed to be, among the heights of our joy over the course of the year, there is, during that second cup, the opportunity to lessen our joy. So as we lessen our joy in memory of the 10 plagues, I encourage you also to think about all the other plagues that exist among our friends, our family, Israel, and the world, and how we can begin as a civilization, as the Jewish people, to seek to alleviate those plagues. So what additional plagues are there in addition to the other 10? What plagues affect us today? Homelessness, ISIS, poverty, apathy, racism, anti-Semitism, sickness, disease, drug abuse, Al-Qaeda, natural catastrophes, right? Acts of God, as they were, poverty. So I encourage you at your Seders tonight, as you're explaining how many plagues there really are to the people sitting around your table, that perhaps we'll consider taking even more than 10 drops out of your cup of wine. We still have to drink a full cup of wine, that's a mitzvah. But perhaps we'll consider thinking about the modern plagues that affect us. And as you continue to lessen your joy by removing some of the drops of wine with your right index finger, then perhaps as you're removing and lessening our joy a little bit, we'll begin as a people, certainly as a community, to think about how we might begin to address the wrongs in this world, how we might begin to lessen the suffering of all those who suffer, whether it's from the effects of ISIS, Syria, how we might further protect Israel from Iran, from its other threats, how we might help Jews battle anti-Semitism throughout the world, and how we might even look at all the tsuras that we have in our own country: poverty, homelessness, lack of education, etc. With that, we'll wish everybody Shabbat Shalom and a good night.
Right.